Hello, welcome everybody. My name's Jesse, and I'm hosting this evening. We've got all our authors sitting next to me. To my left is Rayya Elias. She is a Syrian-born author, musician, and also a hairdresser. She's directed 2 short films, and she's here with her book Harley Loco, which has the byline, a memoir of hard living, hair, and post-punk from the Middle East to the Lower East Side. We've got Tim Cope. Tim's an Australian adventurer. I've known Tim for quite a few years. He has a special interest in cultures of Central Asia and Russia. A lot of his journeys have been based up in the north part of our planet. But he's here with his book On the Trail of Genghis Khan, an epic journey through the lands of the nomads, which was a 3-year, 6,000-mile journey by horse from Mongolia to Hungary. That's epic. Epic, epic, epic. To his left, we have Robyn Davidson. Now, according to her publicist, she's an award-winning travel writer, novelist, scriptwriter, and essayist. But they didn't add that she's also an adventurer. I think you should get them to add that, Robyn. Her book, Tracks, has been made into a film, and I'm sure we're all aware of that. It's a story of her trek through Central Australia with camels. Pretty epic, pretty epic. But she's also done a lot of other things. She's also written a book about a trip or a migration that she did with people of northwest India. So the nomads up there, and Tim also did his trip the nomads, so maybe you guys can have a nomad chat in the middle of all this. And finally, to Robyn's left is Elizabeth Gilbert, who I'm sure a lot of you know from her book Eat, Pray, Love, which sold more than 7 million copies worldwide. 10. Wow. I'm not been given the right information. Maybe I messed that up. 10 million copies. And she's also here with her new book, which is called The Signature of All Things. So the one thing all these authors have in common is that journeys are a part of their work. And so that is the theme that I suppose we'll be leading off from tonight. So I wanted to kick off tonight by asking maybe you all, in whoever wants to jump in first, do you think it would be possible to write the works or any work without the experience of journey in your life? Would you still be authors?
We're all terribly shy people.
You go.
Do you want, really?
Yeah, why not?
For me, that's an excellent question. I've never been asked before, and the immediate answer is no, I don't think it would be possible for me to be a writer without even the smallest journeys, because people are always telling you when you're a young author or a young want-to-be author to write what you know. And having grown up in a very small and sheltered small town where not much was going on, I felt like I didn't know anything. Don't have anything to say because I don't know anything yet. And I had to go out in the world to find stuff out and to go roll around in it. And no matter what it is I'm writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I have to go smell it and touch it and feel it. And there are authors who you could lock in a closet and they have such breadth of imagination that they can invent universes. And I'm not one of those people. I'm really, even in my fiction, I'm a reporter of the world as I find it. So I would say I can't imagine how I could do it without going out there and putting my hands on it.
Yeah, it is an interesting question. I think the journey is so embedded as a metaphor in all our lives. You know, it's the journey from birth to death. It's pretty fundamental. And the structure of a book tends to be like that. Of course, there are structures that aren't quite like that. But in my own case, like Liz, I had a pretty limited beginning. I mean, an interesting beginning, but I came out of my childhood with a deep understanding of how ignorant I was. And that's been the best piece of knowledge. And I still have that piece of knowledge, and it keeps pushing me through the world, learning and learning and learning. You never stop learning. It's a great thing to know how dumb you are. But I think there is a difference between fiction and non-fiction in that I'm not a particularly good fiction writer. I've tried it, but it's not my forte. But I do remember that sense of travelling into an imaginary world that had elements of things that I knew, but nevertheless I created a world that didn't exist in the real world. So I didn't need to physically go there. I could do it in my head, and that's an extraordinary sense of strange power, I think. But mainly I like to go out and explore the world and then bring it home and try and make something of it, which of course is also an imaginative act.
I think I was just thinking about it for me when I was probably even 12 or 13 and people would come to the school, authors, and they'd do a talk. There was a part of me that the hair kind of stood up, and I felt a tinge of envy that don't they know that I want to be an author too. And I wanted to be a writer, I think, from a very young age. And the first bit of writing that I really felt I really enjoyed writing, got a great response from, was when I was 15, and I wrote about an experience I had when I was 11 years old, and I'd gone to bed at home. I grew up in Gippsland with 2 brothers and a sister, and I woke up about a week later, having been in a coma. I'd somehow managed to contract encephalitis, and I remember writing about the process of coming out of that coma and not being able to recognise my parents and all the other funny things. At that age, I remember seeing Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs walking across my pillow. I remember seeing a green man in the corner drinking wine, and there was at one stage when, middle of the night, the nurses came in and I was standing up on the hospital bed. I'd ripped the drip out of my arm and they asked me what I was doing, and I said that I was skiing. And I wrote this piece of writing about it, and my school teacher, my English teacher, came to me and said, I've just brought this back from my own mother, my own grandmother, and they've been rolling with laughter, and he said, you can be a writer. But it wasn't until many years later that I was reminded of that. I kind of hadn't thought about writing as something I'd pursued, but for me, the journeys in life have married with writing, and it is a marriage in the sense that there's a mutual dependence. I don't feel as if the writing I've always done, I felt as if the first writing is for myself. That's a way of digesting the experience, understanding it, and then being able to move on and refresh. And when I was halfway through the book I've just written, The Trail of Genghis Khan, there was an author from the States who met me when I was at a stage where I was a little bit overwhelmed, and he said to me, Tim, if you knew what a book was going to be, you'd never write it. And that really stuck with me, because writing itself is also a journey, even if it's non-fiction, because you start with something, you may have an endpoint in sight at some stage, but you really don't know what voice is going to emerge and what you're going to learn in retrospect about the experience you had. So for me, they're intertwined, and I guess you couldn't have one without the other. So thanks.
For me, I mean, I never really thought of myself as a writer. I was always a storyteller. I would tell, if you gave me a seed of something that was true or something that I'd experienced or something that I'd observed, I could build and create a really great story in a room and just, I'm an attention whore, basically. So just give me anything and and I will absolutely sing and dance and do whatever it takes in order to make, the room laugh or cry or whatever it needs. But what I realized through telling stories was that, that I never really expected, that I never really had the sort of wherewithal to think that I could sit down and write. Although I'd written short stories and I'd written music and I'd, written scripts, but to sit down and write a book was just so challenging because it was sort of having to master oneself for a really long period of time. And like Tim was saying, like, it's a journey that you have to take. And 50 pages in, I didn't want to do it anymore because I told a couple stories, I got a couple laughs for myself, I got a couple cries, and then I was like, I'm done, like. But there was something, and something inside of me that just had to get it all out. And because I'd started, it was sort of the first thing that I myself, Rayya, sat down in my lonesome and sort of did from beginning to end. And that was the important thing to me. I wasn't doing it for you. I wasn't doing it for anybody, but for myself to sort of, champion this thing, this writing thing, and actually finish something and have it be a cathartic experience. And then I finished, and I was like, wow, I just wrote a freaking book. I'm sorry, you guys, I do swear, so if anybody's uncomfortable with that, too bad. But yeah, I just wrote this like fucking book, right? And I was like, whoa, I guess, and I still don't consider like, when people say, oh, she's an author, I'm like, I'm looking at the three of them, and I'm like, they're authors. But yeah, so it is, it's a great question, and it's such a journey. It's such a journey to write a book, as you know, I'm sure.
Yeah. I also heard you say that you wanted to write the book because to try and make sense of it all, I guess. Maybe paraphrasing, but does it make sense now that you have finished?
It makes less sense than it ever has. Probably because there's more sense in my head than there ever was before. Like, in my 20s and going through the Lower East Side and being a drug addict and moving from Syria, and all of it was this combustible sort of half-life, right? And now I have sense. I know way less than I thought I knew back then, right? Like Robyn was saying, like, it just feels so good to be dumb, because nobody can blame you for anything, right? But yeah, it's, looking at it, and I think, Robyn says this so poignantly in her book, like, that is story, it's not who I am now. She is not who I am now. Who I am now is, a completely rested being, and that was a turbulent, wave of manic that just blew through everybody and everything and destroyed everything. And now I like to think of myself as somebody who connects and is there to help rebuild.
Liz, Robyn mentioned before that she travels and then she comes back and she writes. What's your process? Do you find yourself doing the same, or do you work on the road?
I think that I've had two stages in my life as a writer, and the first stage, and I think the most important stage, the root growing stage, was when nobody wanted me to be one or cared. I think that's the most important time of your writing life, because the only impetus is your own. Nobody's waiting for it. I didn't have any connections. It's you. You're the only one making this thing happen. And when you're in that stage of your writing life or your creative life, it's really important that you write every single day, because you're the only boss, you're the only editor, you are the only reader, you are the only publisher. You're all the whole story, and you have to hold yourself to that discipline. Now that I've shifted from that stage of my life, and for many years now I've been a professional writer, I write in seasons. I don't think it's as important for me to write every day, and in fact, sometimes I think it's counterproductive. And for me, because I have to gather so much research in order to write any book that I do, there's a season for research, a season for preparation, and then there's a season to kind of get everything out of my way that I owe everybody else, so that I can then claim and buy my silence and my own time to go into a season of retreat from the world to write. And then there's the season to promote, to kind of come out and be here with everybody. So I think of it almost in an agricultural sense at this stage. So I don't write every day, but I am a writer every day. I'm doing something of the business of writing every single day. I was going to say one thing too to add to Rayya's point, and maybe we all in a way have felt this, and similar to what the author told you too, Tim. I think a mistake or a sort of destructive thinking I see people do sometimes with their work is that you'll hear people refer to their work as their baby, and I'm always trying to get people not to say that, because I'm like, it's not a human baby. It can be criticized, it can be cut, it can be taken from you, it can be sold, like all sorts of things you wouldn't do with a baby, right? And if you think that it's your baby, all of those are going to be really uncomfortable experiences. And if anything, I feel like you're creative, you are its baby, right? That's how I feel. Every single thing that I've ever written has brought me into being, and raised me and educated me and shored me up. And I am the person I am today because of the things that I made me. So to answer a question you asked Rayya about, like, do you feel like it makes more sense? Yeah, kind of with every book it does, because it's giving birth to you, the creative process, more than you're doing for it. It's my little wisdom drop there, everybody. Put that one right in the bank.
So to be clear, all us writers up here are writing for ourselves more than an audience that we think will be out there. Is that the general gist?
I'm going to let somebody else take that.
I don't know. I don't know how to even answer that, really. I mean, I'm very aware. I think I'm very aware of what I'm putting out into the world when I write. And there's so much shit in the world. I try very hard not to put more shit into the world. And the problem is that this can mean that you don't write a lot.
See, now I'm very happy to just shit all over the world. Again and again and again.
I don't know. The reason I'm in that state is that I've been on a particular book I've been writing, The Journey, has been going on for about 30 years. And one of the things I thought, when you were talking about how you become yourself in a book, the problem for me is that if an idea for a book has been that long in the gestation process, I have changed radically over those years. So every time I go back to the book, I'm really a different person with a different perspective on my life, with a different point of view often. So it's a very messy book I'm writing.
Tim, I remember visiting you not long after you got back from your epic trip, and your diaries had been stolen from your apartment.
Oh, yeah.
And so can you tell us how that affected the writing of the book? Was it a blessing in the end or not?
Well, it was, just to give a bit of context, I'd been away on this journey for 3.5 years, and probably until that point, I think I'd been continuously writing diaries since I was probably about 16 or 17, and it had been full of wonderful writing that I thought was great, but it was really only for me, and it was a way of getting it out and writing completely unharnessed. I could write whatever I wanted because there was no editor coming in. I could just do it for myself. But yeah, it's been 3.5 years on the road, and these little diaries that I'd recorded, conversations, people, descriptions, feelings, everything else, they were my babies. Sorry to... But this is where a past life of Rayya kind of comes into it, actually, because I'd come back to Australia. I was up at Byron Bay meeting a film editor. We were starting to put together some material for a documentary series, and I came back exhausted. I'd had a vodka before getting on the flight back to Melbourne. My brother picked me up, and we went straight to my sister's in St Kilda. And at that night, I had a terrible dream that someone had stolen my car. And I woke up in the morning and looked out the window. The car was there. We went for a swim in the bay, went back to my sister's apartment, And that's when I realised that I had left my little day pack full of a whole stack of diaries in the back seat, and someone had stolen it. And of course, that street in St Kilda is near Fitzroy Street, where all the halfway houses are, and there's quite a lot of heroin addicts and other people with problems in that region, and it was pretty obvious what had happened.
Me. I swear, they would have been worth nothing to me at the time.
No, well, it was a really, really cathartic process reading your book and getting into that headspace. And no, but someone had taken them and they'd emptied them into a bin or something, and I'd put out these posters, wanted posters, went on the local media and put out a $1,000 reward, but they never turned up. And to start with, I grieved for a few months, but I never told my publisher. And a few months later, I ended up in New York meeting my publisher, Bloomsbury, for the first time. And I remember standing on the top of the Empire State Building afterwards. It was my first time to New York, and it was all overwhelming, looking down thinking, this is the best and the worst moment of my life. I've just got this wonderful contract, and what they don't know is that my diaries are gone. But, well, not all of them, I should say. I think it was about a third to a half of them. But the first sample the sample chapter I'd written was actually without any diaries. It was for a section of the journey. And in hindsight, the book, well, to give you an idea, the first draft was about 1,000 pages. And there's a good reason to have an editor on the other side of the world in New York, because when the first draft went through, I couldn't quite hear, but I could imagine him swearing and almost breaking his back as he printed out these 1,000 pages. But certainly, it made me really focus in on reliving the experience, getting into the mindset, and almost in a meditative way. And I actually recalled too much information, and I was also able to piece together a lot of things. And I think that in hindsight, the diaries would have hindered a lot, and I think the writing I had in those diaries was a lot worse than I thought it was at the time when I wrote it. That's often the case when I look back at them. And I was able to write with this. It was like going on a tightrope with no safety net. I was just writing, and everything that I was writing was in my head. I had nothing to no crutch to fall on, and it was a wonderful experience. And I think the book is all the better for it in some ways. I was very lucky that the chapters where there was very detailed dialogue and conversations, those diaries hadn't been stolen because I hadn't taken them up to the film editor. But it reminded me too that writing is a process, and the book in a sense is the destination, but the book isn't the process. There's so much happens before, and I don't know that any or many authors would ever read their own book. You live through the process, and then you set it free into the world, and then, in a way, one person said to me that it feels as if the book kind of betrays you, because you put all this love into it, and then it goes off and does its own thing, and you have to move on with your life without it, to it in a sense. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and my first book, Lionheart, seems to be like the favourite. The other books have been less popular, and I look back at that book, and what I think the success of it has been is because I was writing it without any knowledge of being a writer or whatnot. So I guess my question is, do you look back at any of your earlier work and think, cringe at any of it, wish that any of it wasn't out in the public domain? Or, in the other side of the question, do you think that there's a charm to your earlier work which you then need to keep continuing on in future works? It's a bit hard for you to answer that, isn't it?
Well, I can answer it as far as music. I mean, because I have a past life and a present life, I feel like, in my past life, I felt like everything I did was great, and I was a legend in my own mind, right? And so when I sort of got clean, then I thought for 2 years, 3 years that there was nothing I could do that could have beaten, a couple of the things that I had done back in the day. And then I started working again. It was like, it was like a child starting to walk again. And I started walking, and I realized that, being of clear mind and body and soul and spirit, that I could actually soar. And so I really, I was unafraid. Like, it felt like before I used to beat myself up with, I still beat myself up, don't get me wrong. Like, are you good enough? Do you belong here? Blah, 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 blah. But I have a voice in me now that says, who gives a fuck? Just do it. Just do it. Move forward, plow through, because you're enough, right? Back then it was like, you're fucked up, but plow through, do it, and you'll never be good enough. And so, even with Harley Loco, I pick it up sometimes and I open it up and I'm like, wow, I wrote that? It feels like it was almost channeled, because I wasn't really paying attention of who I was writing it for, if it was going to have an audience. It was Liz made me write that damn book, and I will forever be grateful, because she was like, you have stories, tell them, sit down and write. And I did. And now I feel like, because I sort of got that out of the way, and because, it's people are reading it and they're actually connecting on many different levels, not just, being an addict or this or that, but on just a real human level of desolation and redemption, And so it has given me so much comfort and so much willingness to keep writing. So the little essays that I'm writing now are coming from a place of a little more confidence and a lot more truth, because when I wrote Harley Loco, I didn't hold back. And then when it went to the publisher, I was like, oh my God, can I take some of this stuff back? Because I didn't really realize that it was going to be published. So I thought, oh my God, I can't, you can't read this. This was written for me. I'm a little more careful now, but the thing is that, there's a strange confidence after putting work out that was so raw, right? That it's like, you can only go one way, and that's up. And so, the essays that I've been working on and the new stuff that I've been working on, it's still not for an audience, because there's a thing in my head that always says, that was your lucky charm, that was your one-off, that was, your one-hit wonder, whatever. But because I can't keep it in, whether it's a song, it's an essay, it's a story, it's a film, whatever it is, a haircut. Liz has been a lot of people have been on the opposite end of that, but whatever it is, it's like, creatively, if it's eating me up, then I got to get it out. And so I get it out to the best of my ability, and that's what editors are for.
I never promised the universe that I would be a good writer. I didn't. I promised that I'd be a writer. That's it. And that's that promise that I made when I was 15 years old, and I took a vow to it, the way that a young woman of a very different disposition might take a vow to become a nun, of a very different disposition. But there wasn't a sacrament for that, so I made one up. And I really seriously, I still think that those vows that I took were on the right track, that I had the right idea. And I just vowed that I would take care of this thing, that I would never ask it to take care of me, but that I would take care of it, and that I would take responsibility for it, and that I would devote myself to it. And that devotion is the difference between a job and a vocation. And when you approach your work as a vocation, you're sort of obliged to not really concern yourself that much with the results, because that's none of your business. And the only thing that got me through writing my first novel that made me cringe, it didn't make me cringe years later, it made me cringe as I was writing it, because I wasn't very good at it yet. I didn't know how to do it yet. I was young, and how would I know? I hadn't done it yet. And every single sentence made me cringe, and around page 70, I just thought, I can't even stomach this anymore. And it's embarrassing me, and I'm just the only one here. And And the thing that got me through it was just, I remember just sort of standing up in my room and saying, I never said I'd be good at this. I just said I would do it. And if people don't like it, they can write their own fucking book. And they won't, mostly. They won't, because they won't get past page 70 because it's so painful, because they didn't make a vocation out of it. And so that thing is the thing that preserves me even when I go back and look at things and wish that they were different or better, or that I was Hilary Mantel, or that I was all these people who I admire. And I'm just like, hey, it's none of my business, dude. I'm just showing up for the thing I was called to do. That's all I got, and I always say to God, if you wanted me to be better at this, you should have made me better at this, But I'll show up for as much as I've got, and the rest of it's not up to me.
Very good. The hanky's behind me, isn't it? Yeah, it's a funny sort of thing, because I didn't ever think of myself as a writer, so I didn't go through the process that Liz has been talking about believing yourself to be a writer and then doing the hard yards. I'd always loved writing in the sense that I wrote letters and I wrote dreadful poems and that sort of thing, but the idea somehow that I could be a writer just never occurred to me. And I was quite a lost soul, I suppose. I didn't know what I could do as a musician, but I didn't think I'd be a musician. I was, there were all sorts of ways I could have gone. And I did a bit of what Rayya did, only I did it in Sydney. And that wasn't going to be a career either. And I also, when I did the journey across Australia, I, at the time, had no intention of writing about it. So it was really by chance that book was born. But I remember it came with such ease. It was an easy birth.
You guys don't have to apologize to me for that. That's my own dogma.
Well, no,
don't worry about it.
It is a bad metaphor, you're right. But it was a relatively easy process, and I think the first draft was written in 3 months in this crappy little flat in London. And then suddenly the book, sold zillions and 16 languages, and there was little me, the genesis of it, and I had nothing with which to understand what was happening. But the most difficult thing was, it was great too, I don't mean that it was all difficult, it was a hoot, but the sort of mind-screwing thing was that everybody, and I mean everybody, said, oh, you're a writer. Fantastic, you're a writer, so what's the next book? So it's a funny old thing. It just shows how different all our experiences are of the identity of being a writer and of also how our books come into the world. It's, everyone has a unique experience of it, I think. Just one more thing about that, apropos of the question Jessie asked. Obviously, I'm known for Tracks, and Tracks has been what I've been known for since 1980. And I tried very hard to escape that by just doing anything that was not at all like Tracks in any way. And eventually it sort of wore me down, and now I think, well, hell, there's worse things to be known as a camel lady. Okay, all right. Yeah, so I don't mind anymore.
How are we going for time? We're all good, yeah. Tim, can you answer the same question?
I'll just add a little bit, because I think everyone's said a lot. But I'll just say that one of the feelings I had with writing as well as journeys was I had a really strong urge to kind of live unscripted, if you know what I mean. I didn't want to feel as if life was being if people were giving me parameters through which I had to follow, through which I had to travel. And one of the most exciting things about setting off on the horseback journey was that I couldn't ride a horse particularly well. In fact, I'd only been on it for about 5 days before the journey started. But the concept that for 10,000 kilometres ahead, not a soul knew I existed, and not a soul knew I was coming. And so every day was unscripted, and every day there was an opportunity to walk into someone's life, and they would have the opportunity to kind of take me as I was in all states of disrepair, and I may have been riding all night in the desert in Kazakhstan, or I may have been ill, or whatever it may have been. They had no time to prejudge me or anything like that. And so these relationships formed, whether it be over a 5-minute cup of tea or over a vodka, in a way in which I've never experienced, with neighbours that I grew up with over my whole lifetime. And it was the prospect of all these possibilities happening that made it so exciting. And for me, the writing is exactly the same. And I was reminded, as you were talking, Robyn, about that just before I set off, I was in the car on the way down to Melbourne, and with me on my lap, I had a book contract from Penguin Books, who'd published my previous book. And I'd been dithering and delaying and umming and ahhing about it for a long time, and I decided in the end to throw it out. Now, I just didn't want to have that burden, the sense that there was an expectation. I wanted, perhaps as you were mentioning earlier, I wanted to just simply to go out and to let it evolve as it was, as a journey and as a life experience, without the perception that it was somehow, predetermined or preconceived. Or even contrived. And I met Penguin many years later, and they said that it sat in their filing cabinet for about 10 years until they eventually threw it out as well. But I look back at my first book every now and then and might read a page, and it's a wonderful thing to be able to look back at a younger version of me, and I don't see it as cringeworthy. It's just like the seasons that Liz was talking about. Every season has a different theme, if you like, and it's a different stage in your life that you're going through. And it's nice to think that the book accompanied me through that stage of my life, and it remains as a marker for what's past. And, yeah.
Cool. And Tim, you also had a companion on the journey, other than it being a horse. You had a 4-legged companion that wasn't a horse or a camel.
I was in eastern Kazakhstan. I just arrived, and I didn't know at that stage it was going to be the coldest winter in about 40 years. And I just bought 3 horses, and I'd met this man called Asset. I'd met him in a taxi, actually, after I'd arrived in Kazakhstan. The car had almost turned over on the ice. We almost had a near miss, and in that way we came close. And he said, "Look, I'd love to travel with you," and it turned out that I ended up in his village. He decided to join me for about 2 weeks, and at the end of those 2 weeks together, we'd seen the first few blizzards on the steppe. We'd also shared a tent together and realised after the first day that we only had one sleeping bag between us. So we took turns. He would have the horse blankets one night, I'd have the sleeping bag, and we'd kind of take turns. He always used to say that he could sing very well after vodka, so he'd be on the horse all day with the whip in his hand and singing these beautiful melodic, sometimes melancholy songs about nomad life. It was like the nomad world and nomad history came out from dormancy in him, because he was part of a generation that had been ripped up from that way of life and put into collective farms and villages. Anyway, to cut a long story short, at the end of that time he said, "Tim, you need a friend on this long road, someone to keep you warm at night in the tent." And he gave me his little 6-month-old pup, whose name was Tigan. And I didn't think that this little guy would survive more than a few weeks. He used to leap off the snow at that stage. It was the first winter of his life. He'd leap off the snow onto my shoulders just to get his paws out of the cold. But he grew up with me.
How long was he with you for?
He was with me, well, the journey took 3.5 years, so he would have been with me for about 3. And he kind of grew into a man in more ways than one. He became much more the Genghis Khan than I. There was one stage, I actually got an email from the Academy of Sciences in Moscow, and they politely asked me to start sending child payments back, because Tigan had left a whole litter of puppies at the research farm, and I thought he was having a terribly boring time while I left him to go and look after some visa arrangements. But yeah, no, he spread his DNA right across the step in the spirit of Genghis Khan. So, yeah.
Cool.
I think he's here, isn't he?
Yeah. Well, do you want to? We can kind of reveal it now, I guess. That after
Yo, Tiggy.
Tiggin
He's off with the girls.
is off.
I don't know.
Okay, here we come. But Tiggin spent
And
1 year.
that's the end of our show, ladies and gentlemen.
Tiggin spent 1 year in quarantines in Hungary and in Australia, and eventually took about $10,000. And one day after a year, I got a lovely letter from the quarantine services here to say that I had a permit to bring him out. So I got him in a taxi from Budapest to Vienna, onto Dubai, where he had one night in a $500 air-conditioned room. And then it was on to Australia. And he's developed a good taste for rabbit and kangaroo. In fact, where I live now, up in the northeast near Mount Beauty, up near Falls Creek, he was known a couple of years ago for herding up a whole mob of kangaroos into the main street, or at least very close. So. But
All right.
for me, he was when I came back, I felt as if I was really a fish out of water, and I'd lost the horses, the journey was over, and Tiggin, come on, Ma. But Tiggin was the beginning of kind of bridging those two worlds, and I'm more than happy to have lost my diaries, given that I got to keep Tiggin.
Okay, look, we've got time for some questions.
Some words, Tiggin?
The questions about my novel, The Signature of All Things, that just came out, and about the research, basically, because it spans about 140 years and starts in Europe, and then starts in Philadelphia, and then goes back in time to England and to Holland, and then Peru, and then Tahiti, and then back to Europe. So it sort of circles the globe because it's about 18th and 19th century botanical exploration, and that's a story of world circulation. And so I had to go to all those places. It was terrible. It's terrible that I set half the book in Tahiti and had to go to. It's awful. It's just the price you have to pay to make art, you know. I live very close to Philadelphia, so most of the book really takes place in Philadelphia, and there are wonderful historical centers there where I was able to get a lot of help and assistance. I went to Kew Gardens in London to do research there, and to the Hortus Botanical Gardens in Amsterdam to do research there. I'd been to the Andes, so I didn't bother to go back. Most of it, though, came from reading. Because I like to travel and because I was able to travel, I went to those places in person, and that certainly added to the texture of the book. But really, 95% of what's in that book came from reading sources from that time. I got a lot more of descriptions from Tahiti about reading 18th century missionaries' descriptions of Tahiti when they were there, because that was much more appropriate to the story than anything that I was going to see. They have Dunkin' Donuts in Tahiti, right? So like my experience of it was not going to be what Alma's experience would be. So really, so much of it was done in libraries, more than in person. But those last little touches came in person, the way that the palm trees sound and the way that the sand feels. And those are the sorts of things that you have to kind of go and collect with your own hands. But I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you. I enjoyed making it. Any reputable esteem that I had before writing a memoir about a woman's journey was erased by having written a memoir about a women's journey. And that's, that's just kind of how it is, and it's worth doing anyway. It's worth doing anyway. And I there's a big battle about that going on in the States right now that I haven't really joined into, just because I feel like Jesse Jackson always used to say the best defense against sexism is excellence. The best defense against racism is excellence. You can fight it, or you can just be excellent. And so I just continue to try to be excellent, and wait for everybody to kind of like get used to women telling their stories, which will happen. And I mean, I certainly, look what you faced when you read tracks and you see, even as I was traveling, I was welcomed in a way as a storyteller and as a woman and as a traveler in such a different way than you were, where you were insulted and degraded and abused for being, like in a really hardcore way. And we were talking about that today, those early scenes in Alice Springs. And that just, to me, when I read that, I just think, oh my goodness, I bow down to you for being one of the many people who paved the way for me to, one, be able to be a traveler, and two, be able to tell my own story. So, so it's an honor to share the stage with you. And the next generation will do it without even thinking.
Yes.
Exactly. And so the world turns and improves, and we're all grateful for it.
Indeed, mutual.
Well, for me, as a human being, there's no other way to live but to speak my truth. I think anything else is just a circus. Anything else is... The truth is going to come out no matter what, right? Like my truth, your truth, it's all going to come out. It may be a really painful journey of trying to push it down, trying to kick it under the rug, whatever we do, it's going to happen anyway. So my whole thing is like, speak it, as long as it's not hurting anyone else, keep my side of the street clean. Like, that's my whole thing. If my side of the street is clean, heart, soul, spirit, in every way, in the kindest way I can be, but not in a way where not telling the truth may spare somebody's feelings, right? Keep my side of the street clean. Everything else is none of my business, Everything else is none of my business, because if my truth is going to hurt somebody, then they just have to, speak their own truth or deal with it. Because I can't, it eats me up to not be able to get it out. And I've learned through a lot of life experience that, what eats me up will destroy me. So I always say, truth has legs, it always stands.
Look, everyone assumes that memoir is an easy form. It's actually, I think, the most difficult form, because you're in a sort of triple bind, because you're telling the truth, but it's an imagined truth. You have so many difficult moral equations to make. And I think all of memoir necessarily is inside, because you're remembering, and all remembering is an act of imagination anyway. So of course, you make it appear as if this landscape you're remembering is how it was, but it is not how it was. It's an imagined, a memory is a form of imagination. And I think the more you get into, I don't know if Liz agrees with this or not, or Ray or anybody, but it seems to me, and because I'm struggling with writing a memoir and it does affect other people, so there are all those sorts of things going on, I have to think about these things really, really, really deeply. And it does hold me up. It does make the work very slow. Because it seems to me you're in this strange world of imagining reality, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's a weird one. It's a twister.
And I was just thinking, there was a quote that you used in your book. I think Alma may have recalled it in The Signature of All Things, and it was from a book called Montaigne. It was something like, there are two things that are always singularly found together, and that's it was super celestial thought and subterranean conduct. And that really stood out to me, because of a lot of what I felt like I was dealing with in not only the writing but the journey, was dealing with this really fascinating dual capacity that humans have for different things, good and bad and everything else. And part of writing for me has always been about trying to find what the actual truth is, And often it's very tricky because a person can exhibit the same things in parallel simultaneously. And one of the things that struck me with your book and yours, Rayya, was the way in which the strengths and weaknesses, there's a fine line between when they kind of compensate for each other and complement each other, and when it becomes duplicitous in a negative sense. And that was has been my experience of trying to find the truth, and that has, staying in Akbakai, which was a gold mining village in the middle of Kazakhstan. When I arrived in the winter on Christmas Eve, one of the horses had an abscess. It was struggling to move, and I kind of decided to take refuge in the nearest place I could find. And I'd imagined that there'd be a lovely family waiting for me in a beautiful kind of firelit room, that there would be a barn full of hay and grain for the horses. But of course there was these two shadowy figures who thought I was a lost Russian geologist and took me into their hut. And in the morning it turned out that Misha and Grisha, or Grisha and Vitka, were these two fairly notorious Russian alcoholics who went on to say something like, "Tim, sit back, don't worry about it, everything's going to be fine. We're going to find you a wife. You may as well sell your horses now, we'll get a camel, and you're going to be set for life, everything's going to be good." And these men went on to tell these horrible stories. I remember at one point, one of them woke me at 3 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Day, and he shook me awake, and we're in this tiny little hut. They'd kind of collapsed together drunken on a little spring bed. They had puppies that they were raising in the room to eat to survive, and they had a little frying pan in the corner, that thick of many years old of grease and old potato and everything else. And he woke me, and he's kind of got this hair that's well, it looks like hair, but it's actually grease over his bald scalp, and this great big mossy moustache. And he says, "Tim, you've got to meet my wife. She's as honest as they come, as any woman you'll ever find. The time that she murdered our friend in the kitchen at home with a kitchen knife, she called the police herself. Only another 8 years, and I'll get to see my darling." And these people, on one hand, I grew up in a fairly sheltered environment in Gippsland. I hadn't had any exposure to alcoholism. I felt like a relative virgin in all respects when I read your book, Rayya. The life that Rayya has lived in the urban world in Detroit and New York is left. It took me through another journey altogether. When I read it, and it's still with me. But that was a really confronting thing for me, and then trying to find out in retrospect, the good and bad. And those were lovely men who saved me and the horses in my life, and I'll be grateful for them forever. But it was like appealing to the better side of human beings was always the best approach, but finding truth was always tricky.
Always ask for mercy. Always ask for mercy and not justice. That was my big thing.
That's awesome.
I wrote a whole book about that. It's so hard to answer that question because it sort of either has a book-length answer or it has no answer at all. Do you know what I mean? Because the reasons that we do anything are so manifold and so tied up with what's happened to us and what hasn't happened to us. And the only answer I can ever give about that has any sort of credibility at all is, why wouldn't I have done it? It was great. Tim, sorry, I shouldn't have.
No. I've always wanted to say that. So I'm glad that you've done it. Not to be rude, of course, but it is very difficult to not be trivial when answering it in short. But for me, in a sense, the meaning evolved through time. I set off with a motivation. I wanted, I guess, if I could try and put it simply, as I said earlier, I wanted to not live a scripted life. I wanted to break free of the confines of our society and look back at our world from a very different point of view. So I wanted to go into Mongolia and the steppe of Eurasia, where there are no fences for tens of thousands, well, many thousands of kilometres, where people only own as much as they can carry. There's no such thing as private property. And people live very close to the elements, literally a couple of inches of tent felt separating them from the extremes. And I felt very much like a fraudulent tourist. When I first went to Mongolia on a bicycle, I was just a tourist passing through. And it was a childhood dream. You know, I often remember as a kid growing up in Gippsland, walking up to a hill and looking down over, whether it be the Latrobe Valley, whether it be down at Wilson's Promontory or wherever, trying to imagine what that landscape might have been like before it was completely, you know, changed by colonial times. And I often thought to myself, I would have loved to have been born here about 500 years ago and what that life might have been like. I wanted to, and Mongolia was a chance to live that life for me. But there were lots of other reasons. I'm fascinated by, I guess, anthropology, if you wanted to somehow term it, but the way that humans fit hand in glove with their environment. And the other answer I'd give is that when I was in Kazakhstan in spring, I distinctly remember riding along with these 3 horses. By that stage, they'd become like a part of my family. And Tigin was off chasing hares and foxes on the horizon. There was nowhere to be. I had a compass in my hand, and there was nothing hemming in thoughts or land or sky or anything. And it was just a kind of freedom that I feel really lucky and privileged to have experienced. And when I was out there, I thought, why don't more people want to experience this? Because this is it's heaven, really. Yeah.
And I'd just add one thing to that, that need to not be scripted, was that what you said? There is something that I really relate to in that, and that is that this is not why I did the trip, but it seems to me that it's an ingredient of the way I've tried to live, which is that I'm constantly trying to get a different perspective on what I've been told is normal. Because believe me, this is not normal.
Yeah, I love that. I love that because although I had such a different journey than you guys, obviously, through urban landscapes, but I grew up in a Syrian, very traditional Syrian family, and all I ever wanted to do were to push the boundaries and the borders and not feel so confined within that. And although my journey I would never wish on anybody, but it is mine, you know, I claim it, I own it, and I wouldn't take any of it back. But there was a sense of, you know, the rebellion of being in your 20s and being in an urban landscape like that and not feeling any loyalty to anything but the sort of the excitement and the surge of being in that big city, you know, and just running around unscripted, basically, and just creating your own family, creating, you know, your family outside of your family, creating like you did with your horses, you did with your camels. You know, Liz, I don't think you did with a bunch of Italians, bunch of Indians, and a bunch of Balinese. No, but it's just, you know, there's a freedom in that, and there's a beauty in that, and of just letting it all go, even though, you know, there's nothing beautiful about my trip, what a trip. But you know, looking back, it's just, you know, it has really sort of, I mean, I think they've all made us who we are. Like when you take a lonesome trip like that, and it is lonesome, you know, whether you're in a city of 14 million or in the desert, you know, it is very lonesome, and you learn everything there is to know about yourself.
I have a friend named Amy Purdy who lost her legs to bacterial meningitis, one of those, like, had a cold and woke up double amputee, you know, just one of those crazy things that happened when she was 19. And in the hospital, she woke up with this thought that I think is really, and she's now had an extraordinary life. She's a Paralympic snowboarding champion, and she every time I don't want to go to the gym or when I'm complaining because I stubbed my toe, I'm like, Amy Purdy won an Olympic gold medal with no fucking legs, Liz. You can go to the gym, you're a little tired. Anyway, she woke up in the hospital and she had this incredible clarity of thought that she told me, where she said, if my story was a book, what would I want this character to be like? This person who I am. What would I think would be the most interesting person for this person to be? And the most interesting person for this person to be would be somebody who would have a really interesting response to having no legs. And I want to live my life accordingly. And when you put it in those terms, and you recognize that really that's the question that each one of us is faced with in our very short duration of our story. Like, if this were a book, what would you want that person to be? What would you want them to see? What would you want them to do? What would be the most interesting character that you could imagine? And what has been so delightful about sitting on this stage is that each one of us in our own way have done that. We've written our own story. And as much as it's been unscripted, it's also been scripted, because you scripted it by deciding to go do that, and by deciding to veer from the script, you wrote your own story, and then you literally wrote your own story, and the lovely thing about then publishing the memoir is that we're not done writing our own stories. We just wrote those little chapters for public consumption, but in the meantime, we've all gone on to live really interesting, strange, unusual things that we're still doing. And so what I hope and think is so lovely and empowering about memoir is that it will invite people to ask themselves that question. If I were the hero of a story, what would I want that person to be like? Go write that story. Whether you share it with us publicly or just live it as though your life were a novel, write the most interesting person you can be.
But that's it tonight for that. So thanks
you
everyone.
so much,
Thank
Jesse.
you, Jesse.
And thank you, Brendan, for making this happen. Thank you.